In this video, we're going to look at a relatively simple concept when it comes to supply and demand, but it is a core concept of supply and demand. And what that is outside factors shifting the supply and demand curve. Okay? So what we've been studying so far is really simply if price is too high or too low. So off to the side, we can look at it like this, supply and demand, and if price should be right here, that's price and quantity equilibrium. If the price is too high, we know that quantity demanded is going to be lower and quantity supplied is going to be higher. And we know if the price is too low, it's going to be the opposite of that. Quantity demanded is going to go higher and quantity supplied is going to go lower. All right, so we've just simply been looking at what happens if prices are too high or too low. But one of the keys here is what changes the price. Why are prices actually changing then? Well, one of the reasons why prices are changing is because supply and demand change. So we're going to look at this in kind of isolated terms, where we'll look at just supply and just demand, but there are times in which supply and demand could both be changing at the same time. So we should understand that there are certain things that change the supply curve and certain things that change the demand curve, right? And we've studied those determinants, right? So the number of producers, input costs, right? Technology could shift those things, taxes, subsidies, all these different things could change the supply curve. And for the demand curve, it could be like the number of people, right? So the population changing, income, certain expectations changing, tastes, advertising, and then certain related goods like substitutes and complements. Right, so these are the shifters. These are the shifters of supply and the shifters of demand. And so we've talked about those and we've seen supply and demand shift, but we've never actually seen it when we're at this point of equilibrium, or we've never seen it where it might change the actual price. So in order to do this, we really just have to remember that it's either supply can increase or decrease, demand can increase or decrease. So we want to, once we learn one, it's really just applying that same concept over and over again. So if we look at our price and quantity, and we have a supply curve and a demand curve, we're going to put ourselves at equilibrium like this. And this is the longest example we'll do to understand kind of the steps. But what we assume is things are all kind of happening instantaneously. So let's say that for whatever reason, the input cost of producing lemonade goes up. So the cost of lemons increases, right? The cost of lemons increases. Well, that's gonna affect my supply curve. And I know that my supply curve would shift to the left, or it would be more costly to produce it. So I'm going to show this supply curve shifting to the left like that. Well, now what we can see is that this old supply curve disappears. So I'm gonna largely erase this old supply curve. I'll leave a couple of little things, but that curve is gone. Right? That curve disappears because it has shifted to the left. Right? So it's shifted to the left. And now we have this sort of situation. Well, now here's the price. Price hasn't changed yet. I know supply shifted to the left, but the price didn't change. But in this quantity here, that quantity is now the quantity that's demanded only. Right? This quantity is the quantity supplied. Why is the quantity supplied less than the quantity demanded? Because the supply curve shifted to the left and the price is still right there. And we know that this price is too low now in our new reality of this supply curve having shifted to the left. So what do we know is going to happen if supply shifts to the left and the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied? Well, we know we have a shortage. We know that when we have shortages, there's consumers out there demanding those goods that are in short supply, right? And so what they're going to do is they're going to bid the price up. So as consumers start bidding the price up, you're going to have fewer consumers willing and able to buy. And as consumers are bidding the price up, you're going to have more and more sellers willing and able to sell. And it's going to move us to this new point of equilibrium right here at a higher price, equilibrium higher price, and a lower quantity than originally. This was our original right there. That's the original equilibrium, quantity and price. And this is our new price and quantity at equilibrium, right? So what we would say happened to this market is that the price went up, PE, price at equilibrium, and QE, quantity, went down, right? So the quantity went from like this point A to this point B right there. The quantity decreased from QD to this QE, we'll call it, of quantity at equilibrium. Right, so all this, you can only really have four things happen. Supply could decrease, supply could increase, or demand could decrease and demand could increase. And I would not memorize what happens to price and quantity. I would simply graph it and show what happens to price and quantity. So what we're going to do is just show each one of those four and kind of real quickly assume we know how we got there, whether it's a shortage or a surplus that causes us to have that price change. So let's show the four ways that we could have price changes. So here we'll show demand, and here we already showed supply, but we'll show it again so we can see the four shifts of outside factors that take place. So here is demand, here is supply. So for each one of them, we set up supply and demand, supply and demand, supply, demand, supply, demand. Okay, and each one of them will show our price and quantity at equilibrium. Trying not to be too messy. Price and quantity. So we could make up a scenario for each one of them if we wanted to, but we ultimately just want to show what happens when demand shifts. So, we could say consumer income goes up and it's a certain type of good. Or we could say that, a substitute price changed or a complement price changed. But either way, let's say demand increases, right? So if demand goes up, D1, we know that our new equilibrium point is going to be there and there. So since demand went up, if price were to be what it was before, we'd have a shortage. And so with a shortage, they're going to push the price up, and you're going to have this new quantity at equilibrium right there. For the next one, it would be if the demand curve decreases. So that's the other thing that demand can do. And if demand decreases, we'd end up at D1 right there. If demand decreases and the price stayed up where it was before, we'd have a surplus of goods. And so if there's a surplus of goods, sellers are going to start competing against each other to sell those extra goods to a limited amount of buyers, and it's going to push the price down to this new point of equilibrium that we would see here at P1 and Q1. So with that, price gets pushed down, quantity gets pushed down. So we would say with this one, equilibrium price went down, equilibrium quantity went down, right? So if you see, what we're noticing is that some outside factor is shifting one of the curves, and we're ending up at these new equilibrium prices and quantities. For supply, again, we could have supply increase, or we could have supply decrease. If supply increases, we'd see this new equilibrium price at P1 decrease, and we would see quantity go up to Q1 increase. And if supply decreases, we would see our new equilibrium points like this, P1 and Q1. Right? So for this one, price went down, the quantity went up. And this one, price went up, quantity went down. Right? And those are outside factors that are shifting the curves. So as long as we have this idea in our head that you have these supply and demand shifters, those are going to cause shortages and surpluses to take place, but the market acts efficiently, and so it ends up back at this point of equilibrium, sometimes with higher prices or lower prices, different quantities, but it's the outside factor that's shifting a curve that's changing price and quantity. So that's what causes prices to change typically, are shifts in supply and demand. Now, reality gets a little bit more complicated than that, because sometimes there's not just maybe one shift taking place. So the next thing that we're going to look at is, what if two curves are shifting at the same time? So let's take a look at one example in which we see two curves shifting simultaneously, because this is often the case in reality, that maybe it impacts both supply and demand. So therefore, what happens? So this one gets kind of complicated, but let's take a look at an example. So if this is our original supply and demand curve, looks just like this, and we say, okay, for some reason, maybe this is the market for cars, and at the same time, input costs are changing, so too are consumer incomes. All right, so if inputs and incomes are changing, this is going to shift the supply and the demand curve. So let's say in this example that the supply curve increases by, let's just say, this amount, just like that, S1. And the demand curve, I guess I could go consistently with what I had said. We're going to say supply decreases. So let's say supply decreases by that amount. S1 looks like that. And then we said consumers have more income. So in this example, and this is what I'm going to change just a little bit, but let's say incomes change demand by that amount. And then we see our new point of equilibrium at the intersection of S1 and D1, because that's the shifting of our two curves, increase in demand and a decrease in supply. So our new point of equilibrium is this intersection point right there. And so we say, well, what happens to price and what happens to quantity? Well, if we compare our original point, which would be point A, to our new point, which would be point B, we can see that prices obviously went up here, and quantities, they kind of decreased a little bit, like that, to Q1. Okay? But this isn't the whole story, because we know something for sure and we don't know something 100% for sure. So what do we know? We know that regardless of how far demand increases or how far supply decreases, that each one of those things is going to drive price up. So actually, if we go back over to our example over here, and we see that anytime that demand increases, in this example right up here, demand increases up here, that price is going to go up. And we also know that when supply decreases, this example here, that price goes up. So regardless of what's happening with how far each one of those shifts, we know that supply decreasing and and demand increasing, both of those are going to result in price increases. So we're going to put increase. But now here's the problem. What happens to the quantity? Right? With a supply decrease, we know that quantity is getting pushed down. But with a demand increase, we know that quantity is getting pushed up. So these two things are pushing in different directions. So instead of this pink line with demand increasing by that amount, let's say that demand actually increased by this amount. So demand was actually here at D2. Well, again, we would see that price has gone up like we said it was going to, but this time the quantity increased. But nothing changed other than how far demand shifted. So if demand only shifted a little bit, quantity would go down. But if demand shifted a lot, quantity would go up. And so in this example of this double shift, there's going to be one of these two things, either price or quantity, that we do not know. And so typically in economics, we say that it is indeterminate, right? Or it's unknown. So let's look at one more example just to kind of show that we don't exactly know when it double shifts what is happening to price or to quantity. So we're going to look at it actually like this. So let's say that we have a double shift taking place, but we're going to graph these two things separately just to kind of show the easiest process when it comes to finding out what's happening. So let's say this is supply and demand, and this is our equilibrium points right here. So let's say in this example that demand increases and supply increases. We want to know what happens to price and to quantity at our new equilibrium. So we could merge these two things together, but I'm showing it separate. So in this first example, we see that price goes up and quantity goes up. So in this example, price goes up and quantity goes up when demand increases, right? Price goes up, quantity goes up. And in this example, when supply increases, I see that price went down, but quantity went up, right? So price went down, quantity went up. And so we see that price disagrees, right? One says up, one says down, but quantity agrees. Both say up. So what we know for sure is that quantity is going to go up, and what we don't know is what ultimately is going to happen to the price. What will determine the price is how far each one of those two curves shifts, but we don't actually have that information, so we're going to have to say we don't know what's going to happen to the price. It's unknown. And so that is the double shift. One of the rules for double shift is one of the two is going to be unknown. So that's a lot of information on shifting of the curves and finding new equilibrium points, but a major concept found within Unit 2 of AP Microeconomics.